Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. A short while ago, The Economist released an article about what other countries and people want and expect from Joe Biden when he takes presidential office in 2021. We found it really interesting, so we thought we'd produce something along similar lines. It would be easy to say that the world just wants to return to normal political leadership after a rather unconventional 4 years, although that is definitely something the world wants. But it's obviously a little more nuanced than that. In this video, we'll take you through some of the global issues that need resolving, as well as looking at the prospect of Biden leadership from the perspective of other countries and regions. Before we start, for Black Friday, we've dropped the prices of products on our merch store, meaning that a whole bunch of our stuff is currently discounted, including our Countries with Shoes pin badges. You can pick up a high-quality enamel pin representing your country for only $4.49. Check out that and all of the other offers over on the TLDR store. It's linked in the description. The obvious two issues to start with are the COVID-19 pandemic and the big problem of climate change. Let's start with the pandemic. We've had almost a year now of the virus spreading like wildfire throughout the world. Each country has its own policies and there has been cooperation. But at times of crisis, much of the world often looks to the US for leadership. Leadership, which it's fair to say, has been distinctly lacking recently. It's been documented, including by us in July, that earlier in the year President Trump announced that the US would leave the World Health Organization in July 2021. As Joe Biden won the presidency, he's now within his rights to cancel his withdrawal and is expected to do exactly that. Now, the WHO is far from perfect and has many flaws, but it's the best global health institution that we've got, and in a time of crisis like now, it needs to be working more than ever, and that requires US leadership, let alone membership. Part of the way in which the US can lead is through distribution of vaccines around the world. The world is obviously structured in an unequal way, and that's no less the case when it comes to medicine, which is why it's been seen as especially important in this time of crisis that countries who can afford to help others do so. The COVAX plan is trying to make sure that all involved countries are able to provide vaccinations to at least 20% of their population. Unfortunately, under Trump, the US was not set up to do this, but again it's thought that Biden will reverse this decision. In addition, recently the G20 members have committed to making sure vaccines go where they need to be, although this commitment is a little bit more woolly than others. But it's not just the world that needs Biden. Biden needs the world. Although Biden has not been in charge, the Trump administration's handling of the coronavirus has been a bit of an embarrassment for the US. Biden has undoubtedly been preparing for what he'll do on the pandemic as soon as he takes the oath, and will surely be learning from other countries who've been relatively successful in handling the virus. Let's switch track onto climate change now. Much like the WHO and COVAX, Biden will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord that Trump removed the US from. As with pretty much everything, the world benefits with good US leadership on issues like this. With America, policy decisions do not simply affect it domestically, but set a worldwide precedent. Emissions and energy targets that signal a US commitment to climate change will first allow it to catch up where it's fallen behind, but will then encourage other nations to move where needed. The target of being carbon net zero by 2050, when done in conjunction with many other major polluting nations who are already cooperating, will make the dream of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees much more realistic. It could also prevent island countries from being subsumed and reduces the possibility of extreme weather and non-icy summers in the Arctic. These possibilities also better the chances of seeing improved environmental justice worldwide. The Biden campaign did commit to focusing on this topic domestically, so it's conceivable to see the administration taking a lead on a global level. Furthermore, in the last couple of days, Biden has nominated former Democratic presidential candidate and Secretary of State John Kerry for climate envoy. Kerry was an important player in the genesis of the Paris Accord. This isn't really groundbreaking news in itself, but the fact that Biden is making this position part of his National Security Council highlights the importance he places on climate change, which can only bode well for what the rest of the world wants and needs. Moving on to specific countries and regions, let's start with China. the country that is increasingly at the forefront of most of the world's foreign policy. China is a pretty big power in itself, but the two countries need to coexist in the world system for the good of all. There are various things to consider when it comes to what China wants and can expect from the US under Biden. First and foremost, Chinese leadership is probably keen for a little bit less recklessness. That being said, it would be silly to expect that with a change in leadership, a drastic change in policy will also come. Sure, Biden will probably be a bit more diplomatic, but one area where the US is becoming less polarized is in its attitudes towards China. China is not very popular from DC to Wyoming, so it's not like Biden's just going to reverse everything Trump's done. There has been some confusion over Biden's attitude towards tariffs with China. He's certainly not going to increase them, and he's also not exactly likely to go for a speedy reversal. China's imprisonment of the Uyghur Muslims, something we discussed in another video, is something it probably doesn't want any more attention on. And while, according to John Bolton, Trump wasn't initially pressing China on the issue, later in his term he began to be a bit more forceful, which is something we can certainly expect to continue and even increase under Biden. It's also not going to get off lightly on its increasing expansion into the South China Sea, in another continuation of policy between the administrations. America's other major adversary, Russia, won't be expecting any favourable treatment either. Not that Putin is really bothered about that. Biden is obviously not going to cozy up to Putin like President Trump was accused of doing. And Biden's rhetoric thus far has been pretty tough on Putin's state, saying that he sees the country as America's biggest threat in terms of security and alliances. So those are the adversaries, but what about the allies? Let's start with Europe. If you've come to this channel to get away from Brexit, then I have some bad news for you. We couldn't get through this video without mentioning it. And that's because Britain wants a trade deal with the US, but the US arguably has bigger fish to fry. Biden's rhetoric on Brexit has also been pretty clear, with his views on the vote and the potentially damaging situation in Northern Ireland being made obvious. Now, Biden doesn't want to change the fact that Brexit exists, but he won't be rewarding Boris Johnson and the gang. There will almost certainly be a deal down the road. The question is if Britain will have to wait. Trump focused heavily on defence issues with regards to the rest of Europe. He was constantly pressuring countries in the continent to establish defence spending at 2% of GDP. Europe won't be expecting this to change at all, but will want less of the aggressive rhetoric that President Trump's leadership often came with. While still remembering the Biden administration will be keen to help out Europe, it will also not have time to be consistently on the lookout with other threats popping up globally. So Europe needs to protect itself. For example, in regard to the increased Russian and Chinese interests in the continent. But equally, Europe will be keen to keep America happy in order to hold NATO together and keep itself safe. Moving on, you don't often hear too much about US-Africa relations, so we thought we'd take a look at what countries on this overlooked continent might be hoping for from Biden. Al Jazeera ran a nice article looking through this exact issue, in fact. In interviews with various experts, it seems as though there's a mixture of skepticism and hope. In fact, it was argued that the US has unfortunately never been hugely invested in Africa, and Trump never set foot in sub-Saharan Africa in his 4 years. Because of the Trump administration's attitude, many in Africa feel the only way is up in regard to how the US sees and talks about the continent. However, Brian Tamuka Kagoro is quite skeptical on the whole situation, stating that it does not seem that Biden cares enough about or has given sufficient thought to US-Africa relations. And it's not like the continent is suddenly going to race to the top of Biden's priority list. But there is increased hope on some issues, such as human rights and political systems. There's also talk that the Biden administration may look to abandon bilaterals and negotiate trade with the existing continental free trade area. But we'll see what happens with that one. Much of Latin America, perhaps the region most intertwined with the US, is overjoyed with the prospect of new leadership to its north. In a similar way to Africa, there's fresh hope that Biden will bring the desired understanding and respect for a region that suffered from the neglect or malignity of the Trump administration over the past 4 years. Looking at Biden's history and his career to this point, he's clearly been invested in Central and South America, So the area as a whole seems to be hoping that his administration will have more interest in them. And whether the issues be migration and violence in Central American states, or things like economic issues, the US under Biden should start listening better to Latin America, according to former National Security official Ben Rhodes. The same should be said for African countries and other parts of the developing world. Unfortunately, we've run out of time on this video, but there was so much more we could have covered, including perspectives from parts of Asia and the Middle East. But what do you think about what we've discussed so far? What does your region or country expect or want from the new administration? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if we get enough responses, we might make another video discussing other countries' desires. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon when videos like that one are released in the future. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.